All right, welcome back, everybody. Today we are beginning our second unit in our course. Our first unit of the first 3 weeks or 4 weeks of the class dealt with the fundamental principles of Catholic social teaching, so the biblical, the sacramental, and the theological roots. And I asked you in previous videos to keep those principles, those roots in mind as we begin today and go on for the rest of the semester looking at specific individual teachings of the church to see how do those principles manifest themselves in each of these different individual topics. So today what we're beginning with is with economics. And the reason we're starting with this is in particular the text that we're dealing with. This is called Rerum Novarum, written in 1891 by Pope Leo XIII, and this is often considered the first modern papal encyclical that deals with social issues as opposed to doctrinal issues. Most texts, at least up to that point, the popes would deal with doctrinal issues like Mary or Christology or something like that, Mariology, Christology. This document, Rerum Novarum, doesn't deal with those things. It deals with a social issue. Specifically, as we're going to see here, how Catholics think about communism and unrestricted free market capitalism. And starting in 1891, really up till the present, if you were to sort of add up all of the papal encyclicals and then look at what are the topics they deal with, I think the main theme that you will see is economics or work or something related to that. And that's understandable. Think about the 20th century. You had the Cold War. You had the fight between capitalism and communism throughout the 20th century. And then once communism collapses at least in Europe in 1991, then you sort of have this seemingly unrestricted capitalism that wins the day, and even since then, John Paul II and Benedict and Pope Francis have all critiqued unrestricted free market capitalism. So all of this finds its root back in Rerum Novarum. So because it's sort of the first social encyclical, I thought this would be a good place to start. The rest of the semester, these videos, there isn't really a rhyme or reason. There isn't a logic. There are just, in my opinion, some of the most important social issues that Catholics need to be aware of. So, Rerum Novarum, funny sounding name, like all papal encyclicals and church documents in general, begins, the name comes from the first 2 or 3 words of the document, and of course the document was written in Latin. Rerum Novarum we can roughly translate as of new things, right? So think about 1891, what's going on there, and what Leo's saying is, hey, there's a lot of new social changes that are happening at the end of the 19th century, which frankly in many ways continue until this day. And Leo wants to address that. And, normally in a lecture like this, I will provide some historical context in which the particular text is situated, but Leo actually does that for us, and I think he does a good job. Right in the very first section, he's pointing out what are those new things that is happening in society, and then of course the rest of the text is trying to sort of respond to them or show how Catholics can and should think about those. So let's just read that first section. To you and me in the 21st century, we probably will, shrug our shoulders at this and be like, well, yeah, so what? But again, these are new things. These are new things happening at the end of the 19th century. Not everybody fully understands or grasps what's going on, and probably more importantly, the implications of these changes. So let's just read Leo's list here, and I think he does a good job. It is not surprising that the spirit of revolutionary change, which has long been predominant in the nations of the world, should have passed beyond politics and made its influence felt in the cognate field of practical economy. The elements of conflict are unmistakable. And then here's where the list sort of begins. The growth of industry and the surprising discoveries of science, the changed relations of masters and workmen, the enormous fortunes of individuals and the poverty of the masses, the increased reliance and the closer mutual combination of the working population, and finally a general moral deterioration. Notice that last one. There's always people in every age that say this generation is more morally corrupt than the previous, and you certainly hear people talk about that today. The momentous seriousness of the present state of things will just now fills every mind with painful apprehension. Wise men discuss it, practical men propose schemes, popular meetings, legislatures, and sovereign princes all are occupied with it, and there is nothing which has a deeper hold on public attention. So, the growth of industry, so what today we would call industrialization, the discoveries of science, and related to that, the medical advances, I would say. Maybe not so much in 1891, but, when we get into the 20th century, all the many medical advances. Change relationships to masters and workmen, that certainly means employers, employees, and we're going to talk about that, but also think in, the United States of America in particular, although he wasn't American and wasn't thinking exclusively about Americans, but the end of slavery after the Civil War. Right? So what does that do? What does that do to an economy? What does that do to a society when all of a sudden an industry or industries that had a free labor market now all of a sudden doesn't have that free labor? That just ushers in sort of certain economic and social realities. Even though it's good that slavery was ended, there are realities to be dealt with once that free labor market dries up. The enormous fortunes of individuals. Think of the robber barons of that time, the steel industry, the railroads, banking, etc. The poverty of the masses. I mean, poverty has always been around. There's, in a sense, nothing new. But related to that is sort of the urbanization, right? And urban poverty is very different from rural poverty, right? I mean, for one thing, you generally don't have quite the same diseases in rural poverty that you have in urban poverty. And it's just it's sort of a qualitatively different type of poverty. The increased self-reliance. Think of the rise of liberalism. We talked about this last week with John Paul II's critique of that. You can see here a sort of implicit critique of this. What happens when you have radical individualism? Well, surprise, surprise, the bonds of community dissolve, right? And that's something we see here sort of hinted at in Leo, but then really continues until this day. And the closer mutual combination of the working population, and finally a general moral deterioration. Again, that's a claim you'll see in every age. So I think again Leo does a good job of articulating the social changes, these new things that are happening. His text is going to focus primarily on economics. He'll also talk a bit about the role of the state, because often government and economies are intertwined. And of course, at this time, and then throughout the 20th century, what do you have? As I already mentioned, it's sort of fight between communism, which Leo in the text called socialism, but when you read that, don't think of it as sort of, 21st century French socialism, or, they've got free health care in the UK or something like that. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about what we would call communism, right? And then unrestricted free market capitalism. He's going to critique that as well. We 21st century Catholics are probably quite comfortable with him critiquing communism. We might not be quite as comfortable as Americans with his critique of unrestricted free market capitalism. He's not totally opposed to capitalism. Catholicism, for example, is in favor of private property. So right there, the Catholic Church is sort of on the side of capitalism as opposed to communism, which doesn't have private property. But at the same time, again, the Catholic Church is not in favor of unrestricted free market capitalism. And as you would see throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, popes and other, bishops and the Vatican II critique a lot of the sort of fundamental economic principles that undergird American society. So this is a challenge. We as Americans have to, and Catholics, have to think about what is our vision, right? How do we as Catholics and as Americans navigate this reality of living in a capitalist society and being Catholic? Now, to be fair, again, Leo is talking about the phrase I've been using, unrestricted free market capitalism. In practice, I don't think there's ever been any country that's ever been unrestricted free market capitalist, including the U.S. There are lots of examples where you can see state intervention, right? State breaking up monopolies, for example. One example that always comes to my mind is after 9/11, the stock market was closed for, I can't remember how long, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, something like that, because the fear was if you have the stock market open immediately after 9/11, the stock market is going to crash and plunge this country and the world into a depression. And that certainly very well could have happened. But the sort of pure unrestricted free market capitalists would say, let the chips ride. That's what it means to be unrestricted. So let's keep out the intervention and manipulation, they would say, of the market. So this is another question we as 21st century Americans have to think about. How much of Leo's critique even applies to us, because in America, we don't live in a unrestricted free market capitalist society. Again, I don't think there ever has been a complete unrestricted free market society. So this is something for us to talk about in class and for we American Catholics in general to be thinking about. How much do these critiques apply to us? And I think probably a more important question is, how do we as Catholics live out or embody a sort of Catholic way of thinking about economics? So Leo begins with a critique of, again, he calls it socialism. We would call it communism. Let's just read this section. It's sort of, he doesn't go into great detail. He's not writing a sort of economic textbook describing communism, but, he gives us some fundamental principles, and then I can add some critique of that. To remedy these evils, right, the sort of social evils, that the socialists, working on the poor man's envy of the rich, endeavor to destroy private property and maintain that individual possessions should become the common property of all, to be administered by the state or by municipal bodies. They hold that by thus transferring property from private persons to the community, the present state of evil things, think in particular what Leo was saying earlier, the enormous fortunes of individuals and the poverty of masses, right? The sort of growing divide between the rich and the poor. They hold that thus by transferring property from private persons to the community, the present evil state of things will be set to rights, because each citizen will then have his equal share of whatever there is to enjoy. So that's kind of his summary of his understanding of communism. Then he begins immediately to finish out that paragraph some of his critiques, and we'll get into some more of these critiques in a minute, but he begins by saying, but their proposals are so clearly futile for all the practical purposes that if they were carried out, the working man himself would be among the first to suffer. So in other words, communism isn't going to save the working man. It will in fact initially cause him he would be the first to suffer. Moreover, they are emphatically unjust because they would rob the lawful possessor, bring the state into the sphere that's not its own, and cause complete confusion in the community. So several critiques there that you could spend hundreds of pages expanding on. So let me just sort of expand on what communism was. I think especially among young people today, I remember the Soviet Union. I remember 1991. I remember 89 when the Berlin Wall collapsed. There seems to be a revival, especially in the universities these days, of communism. A lot of people young people don't remember it, and I certainly, wasn't an adult at the time, but I remember it. There are a lot of different sort of strains of communism, and we certainly don't have time to get into all of them. But Karl Marx, or Marxism, what did he believe? He sort of assessed the social ills, and a Catholic would say that the fundamental problem with society is original sin, right? The brokenness of humanity, and that sin might manifest itself in the economic sphere, such as exploitation. But Marx said that the sort of fundamental problem of society was economic, and in particular, it was class struggle. Right? That's for him the fundamental driving force of society and the problematic driving force of society. So, few people own almost everything, and they're rich, and they're jealously keeping what they have, and then you have what today we would call the 99 percenters, right? People who do the work, blood, sweat, and tears, and they're given a salary, but it's not enough, and this tension between the haves and the have-nots is what sort of drives society, and it's the fundamental social problem. So what Marx wants to do, and this is not a bad thing, what Marx wants to do is he wants to sort of get rid of social problems. He wants to get rid of that social tension. He wants to get rid of poverty. Again, that's not a bad thing. We Catholics want to get away from poverty. So what is Marx's solution? Well, if the problem is class struggle, then you got to get rid of the classes to get rid of the struggle. Now, how do you get rid of the classes? Well, you could walk up to those rich people and say, hey, we think classes are a bad idea. You've got a lot of money. These poor people over here don't have much. We'd like you to, give your money to them. Of course, that would never, ever work. And those people would either just shout nasty things at you or even worse, kill you, right? So that's not going to work. So one of the fundamental principles baked into Marxism is the idea of violence is a good thing, right? We're going to talk in this class about just war later on in the semester. So we're going to see how do Catholics think about violence, in particular with war. But Marxism says violence is not only okay, but in most cases it's going to be necessary, because again, what you want to do is take the property and the money away from those who are rich, redistribute it to everybody. And the idea is, if you and I have the exact same things, we have the exact same apartment, we have the exact same car, we have the exact same clothes, we have the exact same education, I can't be jealous of you. I can't desire what you have and kill you for what you have so I can steal it, right? I'm not going to steal from you what I already have because we have the same thing. So this was sort of Marx's idea. So of course, this is why you see throughout the 20th century, these sort of communist revolutions. Think of Cuba, for example, and all the people who had to flee from Cuba because they wanted, the Cuban communists and all communists wanted to steal the property. And, as the old saying goes, if you want to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. And so their understanding of violence is that's a justifiable sort of, the means to an end, that the ends justify the means, that if we have to kill some capitalists, if we have to take their property, well, that's just fine. We can do that. And so again, what Leo here articulates, that common property of all is going to be administered by the state. And thus, by transferring property from private persons to the community, the present evil state of things will be set to rights. Leo, again, is not being specific there, but he's talking about everything I just mentioned. The present evil things, according to the Marxist, is this class struggle, and that's the fundamental problem with society. And so get rid of that, and we can set to right these present evil state of things. It should be noted there, what's implied in what I and Leo just said, is that Marxism is a utopian vision, right? Coming out of a sort of Enlightenment anthropology that rejects what Catholics would call original sin, a brokenness to humanity. Enlightenment thinking in general, and you see this manifested in a lot of different types of utopias, says that, step by step, little by little, with progress, there's that key word of the Enlightenment, progress, that with progress we will progress. It may take thousands of years or more, but we can get to a perfected humanity. We can get to a perfected society. And for Marx, part of this perfection of society is getting rid of private property and having all people not just own everything, but owning everything is, again, the symptom of the more important issue, which for Marx was getting rid of class struggle. You can't have class struggle if you don't have classes. You can't have classes if you don't have private property. We just saw at the end of that section there several critiques, kind of just in passing. He doesn't go into details with any of these, although I think they are important. Again, one is the state, that communism brings the state into a sphere that it's not its own. So in other words, the Catholic Church is not anti-government. The state has a place, and Leo's document gets into this later on, and popes throughout the 20th century will continue to elaborate on Leo. So the state has a proper function and has a proper sphere, but communism, he's saying, ushers that. Communism ushers in the state to step into a realm that it should not be a part of. But starting in the next section, I think he gets to sort of his central critique of what communism is. And I think this can be a little bit confusing to 21st century Americans. So we have to understand what he's saying here and get to, again, this is the heart of Leo's critique of communism. So let's just see here. It says, "It is surely undeniable that when a man engages in remunerative labor," right? That's a fancy schmancy term. It just means labor for which you get paid, right? Remuneration means you get paid. So as opposed to slave labor where you do the work and you don't get paid. So when you do work and get paid for it, the very reason and motive of his work is to obtain property and to hold it as his private possession. If one man hires out to another his strength or his industry, he does this for the purpose of receiving in return what is necessary for food and living. He thereby expressly proposes to acquire a full and real right, not only to the remuneration, getting paid, but also to the disposal of that remuneration as he pleases. Right? He can spend that money however he wants. Thus, if he lives sparingly, saves money, and invests his savings for greater security in land, the land in such a case is only the wages in another form. And consequently, a working man's little estate thus purchased should be as completely at his own disposal as the wages he receives for his labor. But it is precisely in this power of disposal that the ownership consists, whether the property be land or movable goods. Let's pause there and sort of unpack what he's saying. He's saying there's three things that are they're all the same. They're just in different forms, and they can change from form to form. And what are those three things? The remunerative labor, right? The work that you do. You're in construction. your labor. You're building of buildings or schools or whatever it is that you build. The money you get paid, right? So you do work. You get paid for your work, and then if you want to hire out a landscaper, pay a landscaper to landscape your house, you're basically taking the money that you receive for your work and hiring somebody else for their work. So again, the money, the remuneration, and the labor are exchangeable in that sense. And then the property, right? So that you take that money and then you go buy a car, or what he's hinting at here, of course, is buying a house, buying private property. And then, 5 years later, if you want, you can turn around, you can sell that property. So now you've got cash again. And then you can, again, if you want, you can take that cash and you can hire people to do work for you. So these three things are all the same. They're just in different forms, right? The work that you do, the money you get paid to do the work, and then the property you buy with that money. And these can constantly be flowing back and forth depending on your decisions. So he's just sort of establishing a sort of fundamental principle of private ownership. He goes on and points out what the socialists do or how they disrupt this. So he says, the socialists, therefore, in endeavoring to transfer the possessions of individuals to the community, strike at the entrance of every wage earner, for they deprive him of the liberty of disposing of his wages, and thus of all hope and possibility of increasing his stock and bettering his condition in life, right? The socialist comes in and says, we're stealing your money, we're stealing your property, so therefore I, the individual, have no right to that, I have no ownership, I have no command over my property or my money, and so therefore I can't make my life better because all I have is my labor, and anything I do with my labor, the fruits of that, the money or the property in a different form, doesn't come to me, that goes to the community. He goes on, what is of still greater importance, however, is that the remedy they, communists, propose is manifestly unjust. For every man has by nature the right to possess property of his own. This is one of the chief points of distinction between man and animal creation. I want to pause and I want to talk about that. When Leo says that this is of still greater importance, I think he's correctly underlining, he's saying, hey, pay attention, this is the most important thing here. And this point here, I believe, is the most important argument he makes in all of Rerum Novarum. This is so crucial, but he kind of just runs right past it without going into too much detail. What does he say here? He says that the problem with this communist way of acting is that for every man has by his nature the right to possess property as his own. Why is it a right? Because the property, again, is simply your labor in a different form. And this is one of the chief points of distinction between man and the animal creation. All right. Think back to what we said at the beginning of this semester, that when we talked about Genesis, that the human beings, men and women, are created in the image and likeness of God. That this is unique or special to us. That all of the rest of creation, though good because it's created by God, is not created in the image and likeness of God, and therefore doesn't have an inherent dignity. And we've talked about how this idea of the inherent dignity is at the center of Catholic social and moral teaching. Think back to John Paul II's text that we just read last week. So, one of the things about being a human being is that we have inherent dignity because we are created in the image and likeness of God. There are other things that we haven't yet talked about that makes us unique, that is distinct from the rest of creation. Think about rationality, right? That we human beings have reason. We can do things like mathematics, right? High-level mathematics. We can do metaphysical thinking, think philosophy, theology, etc., right? So that's something else that sets us apart, right? Your dog can't do calculus. Leo here is saying, here's another thing that makes us human, that sets us apart from the animals, and that is work. To be a human being means that you work, and other animals don't work. Now, yes, you could say, think of a bird will build a nest. So I guess you could say in that sense, animals work. But you've never once seen a bird build a nest, take it down to the market, and then sell the nest for a profit, and then build a company that builds nests and then becomes a millionaire. Birds don't do that. So that type of work is not what Leo's getting at, right? He's talking about, again, work that we do as human beings that's different. It's remunerative. So there are a lot of things that make human beings human. We're created in the image and likeness of God. We have inherent dignity. We have reason. We can do math. We can do metaphysics. And we work. This makes us different from animals. What Leo is correctly pointing to here is what the communists do when they steal your property, they steal your money, which is your work in a different form, your labor in a different form. They are, in a sense, stealing your humanity, right? That they are taking away something from you that is essential to who you are as a human being. In other words, they're trying to turn you into an animal. And that's fundamentally unjust. So that is, I think, Leo's most important point and the most important Catholic critique of communism. You'll hear a lot of critiques of communism, and they're good, or those critiques are often economic, and I'm not an economics professor, so I'm not going to talk about economics here in the sort of macro or micro economic sense. But and those critiques of communism might certainly be true from a communist perspective, from a capitalist perspective, such as one critique you'll often hear is that communism is bad economics because it's, for example, inefficient. Think back to what we said last week about efficiency. Though that may be true, that's not the Catholic critique of communism. Leo gives us several, but this last one we're talking about is the most important. The problem with communism, from a Catholic perspective, is not that it's inefficient or just bad economics. It's theologically bad, specifically anthropologically bad, because communism steals your property, your money, which is your labor in another form, and who you are as a human being is tied to this idea of you work, human beings work. So in short, communism is stealing your humanity, right? That's worse really than just being an inefficient economic system, which that might be problematic in itself. But I think, frankly, Leo, is leveling a more profound critique of communism than capitalist critiques of communism. All right, so again, that's Leo's critique of communism, which we as Americans and Catholics are probably quite comfortable with. But now we have to move on to his critique of unrestricted free market capitalism, and we might not be quite as comfortable with that, so we need to think very seriously about how we as Catholics think about this. And one of the things he does in particular is, again, because he thinks that private property is a good thing, he wants to talk about the relationship between the employer and the employee. How should those two relate? And as we're about to see here, his vision of employer-employee relationships certainly is not what you would get in an MBA classroom, right? You go take an MBA class, and they'll talk about what are the duties and rights and responsibilities of employer and employee to each other. Leo's vision is not what you're going to get in that class. And I hate to say this, but this is true in pretty much all MBA programs, business schools at Catholic universities. I can't personally think of any Catholic university that says, we have a business school, and this business school is grounded in Catholic principles about economics, not capitalist principles. So, there's a lot of critiques of Catholic universities these days. A lot of them are correct, and I think this is one of those. I'm not sure why Catholic universities are teaching unrestricted free market capitalist principles when you're a Catholic university, but I digress. So let's see, what does Leo here say about the relationship between employer and employee? The great mistake that is made in the matter now under consideration is to possess oneself of the idea that class is naturally hostile to class. That's, again, a fundamental communist principle, the class struggle, right? That's fundamental to communists. That rich and poor are intended by nature to live at war with one another. So irrational and so false is this view that the exact contrary is the truth. Just as the symmetry of the human body is the result of the disposition of the members of the body, so in a state it is so ordained by nature that these two classes should exist in harmony and agreement, and should, as it were, fit into one another so as to maintain the equilibrium of the body politic. So what he's saying here is the classes is natural, right? It's just. This is when God created a human being, he didn't create us all as really good at math and bad at metaphysics, or really great at athletics and bad at the intellectual life, right? That we human beings are diverse. God created us that way, and we are complementary. And this idea of sort of diversity within one body is not new to Leo. You can go all the way back to Paul, but of course, when Paul talks about that diversity within the body. He's talking about the body of Christ, not the body politic. But Leo sort of drawing on that sort of idea of the multiplicity and unity of the body and saying, this is a good thing. This is, God ordained it this way, right? We're not robots, automatons that have the exact same, software, for example. Let's keep reading. Each class requires the other. Capital, right? The rich owners cannot do without labor, right? The 99%ers who do all the work, nor labor without capital, right? These must go together. Mutual agreement results in pleasantness and good order. Perpetual conflict necessarily produces confusion and outrage. Now, in preserving such strife as this, and in making it impossible, the efficacy of Christianity is marvelous and manifold. So these classes are natural and good. The problem isn't with the classes themselves. The problem is when the classes become disordered, that they're not in a rightly ordered relationship, specifically when one becomes exploitative of the other. Usually the capital class becomes exploitative of the labor class. Let's keep reading where he talks about the relationship between the employer and the employee. First of all, there is nothing more powerful than religion, of which the church is the interpreter and guardian, in drawing rich and poor together, by thus reminding each class its duty to the other, and especially of the duties of justice. Right off the bat, I think that's really important for us to underline. In the capitalist way of thinking, there are no duties between employer and employee other than, you do work for me and I have to pay you on time and I have to pay you a just wage. And that just wage, by the capitalist principles, is simply whatever you and I are willing to agree to. That's the fundamental principle of a just wage. So there are no, other than that, there are no duties between employer and employee from a capitalist way of thinking. But Leo wants to go on and say, no. There are duties and responsibilities we have to each other. Thus, religion teaches the laboring man and the workman to carry out honestly and well all equitable agreements freely made. That might sound unremarkable, but I think it is important, right? How many times do we see employees take a job and then they not only do the bare minimum of what they can get away with, they do even less than the minimum work that they agreed to do. Never to injure capital, nor to outrage the person of an employee, never to employ violence in representing his own cause, nor to engage in riot and disorder, and to have nothing to do with men of evil principles, who work upon the people with artful promises and raise foolish hopes, which usually end in disaster and in repentance when too late. So again, may not seem all that remarkable, but he's saying employees do have certain responsibilities to their bosses, to their employers, and it's not just show up on work on time and do the bare minimum. Basic respect here. Don't use violence. Don't engage in riots and disorder, right? To disrupt the flow of the company. It's not to say you can't go on strike. Leo's not opposed to striking, and as the text says later, he's not opposed to unions either, but not to riot and disorder. So the employee has responsibilities to the employer. Then he continues on and he gets into the opposite, the responsibility of employer to employee. Religion teaches the rich man that that their work people are not their slaves. That, again, also may sound unremarkable, but think about in our country, we had slavery not that long before this text. That they must respect in every man his, there's that word, dignity as a man and a Christian. So there's one manifestation of that dignity we talked about earlier this semester, right? You have to respect him in his dignity, not treat him like a slave. That labor is nothing to be ashamed of, if we listen to right reason and to Christian philosophy, but it is honorable employment, enabling a man to sustain his life in an upright and credible way. Oftentimes, I think we, in the 21st century and back then, think, well, there are certain jobs that are good, but other types of jobs that are so deplorable that those people are deplorable, and we don't need to respect them, right? That if you do the sort of lowest of the low jobs, working in a coal mine, for example, that again, you are nothing more than, not much more than slave, and we don't need to treat you with dignity. And that it is shameful and inhuman to treat men like chattels to make money by, or look upon them merely so as to much muscle or physical power. Focus on that idea of to treat men like chattels to make money by. Strangely worded phrase, but what is his point? The fundamental problem of unrestricted free market capitalism is that what it does, it says, you human beings, you workers are objects of use for the market or for the company to make money, right? This ties back to what we said at the beginning with Genesis, that we saw that God said that human beings have dominion over the rest of creation. And I said, and I've repeated already in these lectures, that means that all things, including the state and the market, should be in service to the human person. What Leo is hinting at here is that the problem with free market capitalism is that it reverses that. It causes a disorder in the relationship between the market and the human being. That this is saying the human being becomes in service to the company or to the market in general, right? That even if the person is compensated, isn't treated like a slave, he or she is being treated like an object of use. So it's a perversion, a disorder of that rightly ordered relationship. That Catholicism says the human being is the human being is the center of concern, and all things should be in service to it. Capitalism says the bottom line. Everything is in service to the bottom line, including the human person. Think back to an example I gave in an earlier episode where I talked about the guy who works for UPS for 20 years, throws his back out, and so he can't do that particular job, and it's inefficient for the company to retrain him to do some other job, so they just get rid of him, right? He is a means to an end, and when he can't do that anymore, you just get rid of him. He's an object of use. So that's the sort of fundamental critique of capitalism. Let's just keep reading here. Thus, again, religion teaches that as among the workman's concerns are religion herself and things spiritual and mental, the employer is bound to see that he has time for the duties of piety, that he is not exposed to corrupting influences and dangerous occasions, and that he be not led away to neglect his home and family or to squander his wages. So he's saying that the employer has responsibility to the employee, not just to pay him the right wage, but that he's disposing of that money well, he has time to go to church, that he's treating his children well. That's certainly not something you learn about in an MBA class, right? That capitalist principles say that that's not the responsibility or even the purview of any way of the employer. But Leo is saying, no. The employer and employee are in a relationship, and it's not simply an economic relationship. And so that relationship must extend to the other spheres of life, because we cannot and should not, as Catholics, segregate out different spheres of life and saying, well, I'll be interested in your professional life because I'm your employer and you're my employee, but the other spheres of your life I don't care about. I don't think I've said it in any lecture in this class yet, but what does the word Catholic mean? It comes from the Greek kata holos, meaning according to the whole. So this is, I think, a manifestation of that Catholic idea, that idea of we are according to the whole, that we don't segregate out different spheres of our lives, our personal life, our private life, our political life, our economic life, our family life. We don't disintegrate them and have these in different spheres, that these spheres are integrated. They're according to the whole. And so if an employer and employee are in a relationship, an economic relationship, that shouldn't be the only relationship that they're in. And so, as Leo is saying here, that the employer is responsible to make sure that the employee is not taking all of his money, buying alcohol, getting drunk every weekend, and then abandoning his children to starve to death. Again, I think capitalists would be shocked at that and say, what are you talking about? That is not the responsibility of the employer. So here you see, again, an implicit critique of capitalist principles, but also just a different vision of how employers and employees should relate to each other. Then again, the employer must never tax his work people beyond their strength, nor employ them in work unsuited to their sex or age. So treat them justly. Just a couple more points here. One of the things that we mentioned earlier about Leo's critique of communism was that it brings the state into a sphere not its own, right? That the state oversteps its bounds. So that ushers in the question, all right, what does Leo think is the role, the responsibility of the state? What are its limitations? So let's see, what does he say about that? He says, the first duty, therefore, of the rulers of the state should be to make sure that the laws and institutions, the general character and administration of the commonwealth, shall be such as to produce themselves public well-being and private prosperity, right? So both the public and the private. That idea of just talking about of an integration of the public and the private. Kata holos, according to the whole. This is the proper office of wise statesmanship and the work of the heads of state. Now, a state chiefly prospers and flourishes by morality, well-regulated family life, by respect for religion and justice, by the moderation of equal distribution of public burdens, by the progress of the arts and of trade, by abundant yield of the land, by everything which makes the citizens better and happier. Here, then, it is the power of a ruler to benefit every order of the state, and amongst the rest to promote the highest degree of interest of the poor, and by the virtue of his office and without being exposed to any suspicion of undue interference. For it is the province of the commonwealth to consult for the common good. The common good. We don't have time in this class to talk about the common good. I think this is something that your moral theology class will get into. Now, admittedly, again, Leo in the end of the 19th century living in the Vatican, so he's not living in a sort of pluralist society the way we have in 21st century American. So he talks about, the state having not only public welfare, but also the private welfare that includes things like well-regulated family and morality. That, as we Americans know, it gets a bit tricky when you have this sort of pluralist society, and in a republic like ours, and we talked about this with John Paul II, that when you have a plurality of visions of what is good, of what is moral, for example, that what ends up happening, and this was John Paul's critique last week, was that rather than searching for truths, right, that we should have a moral truth guiding policies, that what ends up happening is the will of the powerful of the majority over the minority, the will of the majority over the minority that then imposes its vision, its moral vision on the rest. So, as Catholics, we might certainly agree with Leo on what he's saying here about the role of the state and promoting the moral good, the common good. That becomes a lot more complicated in a pluralist society, United States of America in 21st century. So I think that underlines an important point that we see in this text, but we're going to see throughout the rest of the semester, which is, and we should talk about these things in class, the distinction between sort of this Catholic vision, in many ways sort of theoretical or in principle about economics or just war or immigration or whatever, and then the reality of the ground, on ground, right? In a variety of different cases, but in this case, a pluralist 21st century American society. So how do we deal with the gap between the sort of ideal, the principle, and the reality of society? We're trying as Catholics to enact those principles, but there are a million different factors that prohibit or inhibit us from applying or enacting those principles. How do we deal with that? So I think a perfectly legitimate critique, not only of Leo's text, but of a lot of Catholic texts is, okay, yeah, that's nice, but that's in principle. And how do you apply a particular argument that a pope or a council is making in the United States compared to China, compared to Argentina, compared to any different country? So these are the things that we can argue over, and it's our responsibility as lay people to work through these things, right? In particular here, it's the responsibility of the Catholic business person, business leader, business owner, small business owner, CEO, whatever, to do his or her best to implement these principles. Leo and other popes and theologians, their job, our job is to talk, to think, to put forth these principles. But it's the job of the lay faithful, in this case, the Catholic business people, to go out into the business world and implement these. Because it's certainly not going to be the communists who are implementing this, and it's certainly not the unrestricted free market capitalists who are motivated by things like the bottom line, who are motivated by those things that John Paul II critiqued, maximum efficiency, which then infects our culture, not just sort of our ways of thinking as business leaders. So how do Catholic business leaders in America and around the world implement these principles that are, again, begun here by Leo, but then every pope after Leo talks about this and expands on and goes into greater detail? A couple things about wages. I mentioned earlier that the capitalist principle of wages is simply what the employer and the employee agree on. If you can come to a fair agreement about what the salary should be, then that is just, because those two agree on that, employer and employee agree on that, and then it's simply the responsibility for the laborer to do the work and the employer to pay on time what was agreed upon, and that's all you need for a just wage. Leo, here we're going to see, critiques that and says, no, that's, yes, bare minimum, but there's more to a just wage than that. To labor is to exert oneself for the sake of procuring what is necessary for the various purposes of life, and the chief of all is self-preservation. In the sweat of thy face thou shalt eat bread. Hence a man's labor necessarily bears two notes or characteristics. First of all, it is personal, right? So in other words, labor, remuneration, these are not just sort of professional things. It's personal inasmuch as the force which acts is bound up with the personality and is the exclusive property of him who acts, and further was given to him for his advantage. Secondly, man's labor is necessary, for without the result of labor a man cannot live, and self-preserve is a law of nature, which is wrong to disobey. Now, were we to consider labor merely insofar it is personal, doubtless it would be within the workman's right to accept any rate of wages whatsoever. For in the same way as he is free to work or not, so he is free to accept a small wage or even none at all. But our conclusion must be very different if, together with the personal element in a man's work, we consider that fact that work is also necessary for him to live. So a just wage is, yes, it's personal, right? That I can engage in the work. If I want to work part-time, I want to work full-time. That's personal to me. But the second point Leo makes is, well, it's also necessary. You have to make enough money to live. And what that means is going to be dependent differently on where you live, right? If you live in Los Angeles, how much money you need to live is very different from if you live in rural Montana or rural Kentucky. So he's not giving, percentages or something along that lines. He's giving a principle. That's what popes do. They give principles. And he says, therefore, the principle must be that it's not simply that employer and employee agree on a wage, but that wage to be just must also be enough to make the man able to live, right? So what is a just wage? It's a living wage. It's a wage in which the individual can support himself and his family. If he has a wife, he has kids, etc. So, yes, to agreement between employer and employee, but that those wages must be just. They must be living wages. All right. So just those are the main points from Leo, and not even all of them, just the ones we have time to talk about here. I want to summarize briefly the Catholic way here of thinking about the critique of communism and the critique of unrestricted free market capitalism. Economically, these are two different systems, right? And we talked about sort of the principles of both. But what the Catholic Church is getting at is that even though economically there are different systems, that what they end up doing, the problem of both of them is actually the same. Different economic systems, but the problem is the same. And the problem is this, that from a Catholic view, the human being is at the center of God's creation, and all things must be in service to the human person. The economy, the state, medicine, education, whatever it is, all things need to serve the common good, serve human flourishing. Capitalism in its unrestricted form and communism reverse those, disorder those. What communism says is the state is at the center of concern, and the human being is in service or should be in service to the state. Because, as Leo points out, it's the state that administers this common property. So technically, communism believes that everything is owned by everybody. But in the sort of practical reality of life, somebody has to administer that stuff, that property. And who does that? It's the state. So the human being in communism becomes in service to the state. And this is not just an abstract sort of metaphysical principle. When you look at somebody like Joseph Stalin, who probably killed more people in the history of the world than anybody else, and oftentimes Stalin is critiqued as being, mentally ill, paranoid, sociopathic, a murderer. That certainly might be true. I'm not a psychologist. But what is also true is the fact that baked into communism is the idea that the human being is in service to the state. And so therefore, we shouldn't be surprised when Joseph Stalin or any of the other communist leaders throw their opponents or anybody they feel is opposed to the state, throw them into the gulag, send them off to Siberia, or just murder them. Right? There is a logic to it. It's a perverse logic from a Catholic perspective, but there is a logic. The logic is, if this person is not serving the state, if he is a capitalist, if he is protesting in the streets, is he wanting to subvert society, communist society anyway, he is a problem. And we must get rid of that problem because that problem is not serving the state. So the problem with communism is that it disorders the relationship between the state and the human being. The human being in communism becomes in service to the state. Unrestricted free market capitalism, though it is a different economic system, makes the exact same fundamental mistake. And that fundamental mistake is a disordering of the relationship between the human being and the economy. The bottom line, efficiency, as John Paul II articulated it, that from a Catholic perspective, money should be in service to the human being for his or her human flourishing and for the common good. What capitalism says is the human person is in service to making money, and when the person is not serving the economic goods, then he or she is expendable. So one example I gave again was the idea of the person working for UPS for 20 years, slinging boxes, and he throws his back out. But there's even more extreme examples, right? That when people do things like abortion or contraception. Why? Because children are an economic drain. They get in the way of my freedom of buying or doing whatever I want. Traveling is to whatever country I want on the weekends. That when human beings become financially burdensome, the fundamental assumption is, well, just get rid of them. Because the human person is in service to the bottom line. So again, there are plenty of critiques that communists and capitalists can level against each other from an economic sphere. But from a Catholic perspective, coming at this with theological principles, the problem is the same. Communists and capitalists make the same mistake, that they have a disordered relationship between the state and the human being, or the economy and the human being. That they make the human being in service to the state or in service to the economy. And the reason why Leo was so anxious about this is because in the 19th century and continuing on to the 20th century, a lot of European Catholic workers were going to communism, that they saw the plight of their poverty, especially with this rising industrialization. And they said, well, the Catholic Church isn't giving any responses to this. This Catholic Church is not, they may be nourishing my spiritual needs, but they're not dealing with my economic needs. There's this thing called communism out there that is addressing my economic needs and is going to make me no longer poor. And so a lot of Catholic workers were flocking to communism in the 19th and the 20th centuries. And so Leo was sort of trying to put a stopgap in that. He was trying to stop the leakage of Catholic workers to communism. So that is our first specific issue in Catholic social justice. An economic vision, and we'll continue on next week with the next.